Welcome to Arctic Frontiers Unpacked. Together with me today, I have Romain Chuffart, who is a Nansen Professor at University of Akureyri in Iceland, and also the Managing Director of the Arctic Institute. And today we will talk a little bit about Arctic governance, both the state of Arctic governance, but also what has been, what may be, and anything in between. And just to start off, I want to ask you. So there has been, especially here at Arctic Frontiers, a lot of talk about the concept of Arctic governance. It's been mentioned many times in many different cases. But there are different layers to this. There are different aspects of Arctic governance. So, to you, what is Arctic governance?
Thank you so much for having me. Always a pleasure to be on the podcast. I think Arctic governance, when you look at it, and that's something we've heard for many, many years, there's no global Arctic treaty. So there's no one-fit-all Arctic treaty like you would have in the Antarctic treaty system, for example. So you have to look, as you said, almost at a fragmented legal ecosystem, and also that ecosystem is multi-scalar and has multiple levels as well, but in depth, I guess. So you have the international legal framework, international law, so to say. So when we think about the Arctic, we think about the Arctic Ocean. So we have the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, that's our primary treaty. But when we think of the Arctic and Arctic governance specifically, we also think of environmental protection. So the environmental treaties that apply elsewhere, let's say the Paris Agreement, for example, are also relevant to the Arctic. So it's a constellation of treaties that you have at the international level. And then we speak about this all the time, that the Arctic is made up of sovereign nations, sovereign states, the 8 Arctic states, so to say. And the domestic system, the domestic laws also have some kind of, impact on Arctic governance as the primary actors of Arctic governance. On top of that, you have tailor-made rules and norms for the region. So, for example, the treaties that were negotiated under the auspices of the Arctic Council. So, when you think of the search and rescue, when you think of the 2017 scientific agreements between the Arctic states as well, all those treaties add to, as I said, the consolidated ecosystem. You really have to see it as an ecosystem of norms and regulations that we can call Arctic governance as a whole.
Thank you for that in-depth intro. And what I'm then wondering, you mentioned that there is this network of treaties, this legally binding frameworks that keep everything in check. But the Arctic is also a lot of soft law as well. So when it comes to the dynamics between soft and hard law in the Arctic, how does that play out? How is that relationship in the governance landscape?
I think that's a really good question, especially when we look at Arctic governance or at the center of what we could see the web of Arctic governance, which is the Arctic Council, for example, where we have a lot of principles and guidelines coming, and we hear the term a lot, policy shaping, so there's no policy making capacity from the Arctic Council. And I think that has some form of interactions, especially perhaps at the legal level, to interpret the norms that we have, so the international norms that we have, and make them relevant to the Arctic. It also allows for a more flexible policy response, I guess, on some topical issues. When we think of guidelines for marine pollution in the Arctic, or black carbon, for example, that was a task force of the Arctic Council as well a few years ago. It's tailor-made solutions that perhaps states might be more, let me rephrase, might more easily commit to because of the flexibility they have of not committing to a legally binding treaty.
So kind of because you're not obliged to do something, you kind of have the incentive to actually do it.
I think that's right. And a good example of that was around transboundary environmental impact assessment. For a long, long time, the Arctic states were trying to negotiate something that would be of relevance to the Arctic in terms of environmental impact assessment, perhaps some harmonizing of legal principles that we would have of Arctic-specific environmental impact assessments. And I think it was at the end of the Finnish chairship of the Arctic Council, the second one, the one that ended in 2019, where that work was put in a document that gathered all the good practices of the Arctic state, almost as guiding principles that could be used going forward. So you have, and here that's very simple, it's just, it doesn't really have any legal force or legal might, but it creates incentive to follow up with good practices.
But you're a legal scholar, and what you're saying now is it might actually be also very effective that something does not have these legally binding principles. If I would put you on the spot and say, but what is the most effective? Is it best to have the legally binding or non-legally binding to get something done in the Arctic, for example, with environmental protection?
And I think that's an excellent question as well. I'm going to give you a very legal answer and say it depends. It depends what you want to try to achieve and what is the specific objective that you want to try to achieve. For example, the ocean governance in the Arctic, when we look at the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, that was done through a treaty that took years, decades actually, to negotiate. And it was perhaps not the easiest route. It's not Arctic relevant, but it doesn't have any specific Arctic provision in it, but it has some Arctic relevance. So you can see here that it's something that works well with what we would say hard law, so a convention, a treaty. If your goal is to achieve perhaps quicker action, it might be better to have some form of less legally binding regulations to allow for this flexibility. The downside of this is that you might, if you have a lack of enforcement for international regulations, you might have an even bigger lack of enforcement and follow through when you have flexible guidelines or principles. So it's a balance to be had there when you look at what is the outcome that you want to have out of that.
And when it comes to outcomes, there's been a major disrupting force for the past years in Arctic governance, and that is Russia's ongoing war against Ukraine. And of course, Arctic governance is not the only part of the world affected by this, but we still feel the repercussions. So when we look at the entire governance system or systems in the Arctic, what do you think, if you would say, what has changed? And the reason I'm asking this too is because we can see Russia has removed mentions of all of the different international intergovernmental forums to cooperate in the Arctic. It's they're out of many councils, but still in the Arctic Council, barely for a while. So we can still see that it's been rocky. Some things have survived, some have not. So what's your thoughts on how this has changed the entire landscape? Very, very big question here.
It is a very big question. I think you have to start with the very obvious, is that a sovereign state attacking another sovereign state is illegal under international law. That has been said since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It is illegal. So it is a breach of international law. So it is normal that if you see international law as the legal arm of international relation, it is normal that Russia faces the consequences, maybe not the legal consequences of it, but at least some form of governance consequences of that. Other states might just see Russia as not a trustworthy partner, just don't want to work with Russia, and also just support Ukraine and see that there's some good reasons to support the sovereignty of nation states. I think that being said, and we have to put things in perspective here, as some bodies have survived, or Russia is still investing in other, as you said, the Arctic Council, for example. I think you really have to see the Arctic Council wouldn't, and that's perhaps I guess I would hazard, wouldn't survive a not having Russia in its rank. So I think it's also, again, it's a balancing act of what you want to achieve. It's hard for me to talk as a Western scholar about what Russia wants to do, or why Russia has removed all mention of multilateral cooperation. Perhaps it's also a proof or something, an evidence at least, that it is international law is perhaps not shifting, but at least states are more ready to challenge it, and in the Arctic or elsewhere. But I think to some extent, it's just, for Russia, it might just be that they're more willing to engage in bilateralism and on one-on-one state-to-state relation, because they've seen the limits of multilateralism in that sense. In terms of, again, and for the other states, for the like-minded Arctic 7, as the turn of phrase was back in 2022, I think it shows that they're willing to commit to some of the principle of the rule of law to some extent as well. So it's always again a balance to be struck between interests of states on the one hand and the legal framework you're bound by. So that's a very, I guess, perhaps a more international relation perspective on the international legal order. Legal rules applies to everyone, but as we know, even in domestic legal systems, you have actors breaking the law. That doesn't mean the law is not in place. It just means that you have actors willing to make that step, to make that jump, and to try and to just have other interests than just respecting the law. That doesn't condone what Russia is doing. Obviously, we have to condemn it. It's violent. It's in breach of international law, but it also creates actual violence in Ukraine. So we don't have to forget that. But at least I think there's something that should be said about trying to enforce those rules as well.
So we kind of have to prepare ourselves for more disruptors and disrupting factors in international law, both in the Arctic and elsewhere, while we're seeing what we're seeing right now. But a little bit before we move on, a little step back to the soft versus hard law, because one other thing that's really interesting, what we've seen after 2022, is that there have been many forms that are soft law that haven't really survived, or haven't survived in the format that they were previously. So either Russia is not in, or Russia is in, and it's going a little bit slow forward. However, in terms of hard law, in the mechanisms that Russia is participating in, we can see, okay, they're participating, they're in, but it might be maybe not as effective. And what I kind of want to ask you as a legal scholar, because you have the competency to look at this from a different point of view than, for example, just a political scientist, is that when we take the resilience of the soft law and the hard law frameworks, when they meet this crisis, or a crisis as big as the Ukraine one has been, what's the resilient strength in resilience? Which one might be having a little bit more incentives to survive, maybe not? Do you have thoughts on that?
I think that's an excellent question, and one that perhaps international lawyers do not think about as much as we should in terms of the resilience of hard versus soft law. Or at least soft institutional frameworks and hard institutional frameworks, which I think is what you were trying to get at. I think again it depends on what you want to achieve and how much resources you want to put towards towards the resilience of an institution. There are some international organizations that serve a really good purpose, but when that purpose is not being achieved, states might just feel the need to get out of that institution. And whether they're legally binding or not, there's always a potential exit clause or exit provision in the treaty itself. So it is possible, even if you have a hard legally binding framework in place, to have a state exit that international agreement. I think perhaps I think it depends at which level we're talking about in that context. Because if you look at the Arctic Council, for example, there's no incentive for states legally to stay. As everybody knows, it's a political declaration, the Ottawa Declaration, the founding document of the Arctic Council. There's no incentive for states to stay. They commit resources to produce good science relevant to the Arctic, to inform their own policy making about the Arctic. But I think what we have here is a testament to state thinking that this institutional framework is or could be resilient. And so the resources they put into that promotes it and makes it more resilient. So I think you have, and I think that's something I always say, is that you have to put resources and commit to the resilience of an institution. It doesn't have to be financial resources, it can be political resources as well. But you have to put that effort in. And it doesn't matter, or I think it matters less, whether that institution was founded by a political declaration or a more legally binding declaration or a treaty. I think what matters is where states are interested to put their resources, and we've seen that with under the Norwegian chairship of the Arctic Council. There was talks about the Arctic Council potentially dying down, and it hasn't proven the case. Why? Because Norway mainly as the chair, but also other states committed themselves to try and quote unquote save the Arctic Council from its own death. So I think it's testament to this idea that you have to commit resources for an institution to be resilient, regardless of whether this is a hard legally binding framework or softer framework as well.
Thank you so much for these insights. And I have one last question for you, because we are at a very interesting point in time in the world, but also in the Arctic. We are facing a new Trump presidency, and one that has made its footsteps on the Arctic already very, very prominent, with the question of Greenland. So when you look at this, for example, US saying that we might buy Greenland, but we might take Greenland by military force, do you see this as something that is disrupting the current governance frameworks? But what is the real, what is the real room for action there? Is it a real threat, so to speak? And which challenges are these claims essentially creating?
I think that's a really good question, and cannot speak on behalf of what President Trump might be thinking, whether this is a real threat or not, or if it's just a bargain and chip in some form of political games that they think they could win or leverage in the future in international relations generally. And also, of course, cannot speak on behalf of any of the Greenlanders. And we have, I think my starting point when talking about Greenland is always listen to the elected officials of Greenland. That's what self-determination means, point blank. You have to put that in. And I think this ties to what I was saying at the beginning, is that if we're serious about international law, if we're serious about the, whatever you want to call it, the rule-based legal order in the Arctic, and if we're serious about condemning Russia's actions in Ukraine because it violates the self-determination and sovereignty of another state, then what we have to do is also condemn that kind of rhetoric here, that Greenland is not a sovereign state, but it has a special agreement, the Self-Determination Act, that recognizes its right to self-determination in the future. That right is embedded within international law and has to be respected. And so that means whoever wants to, for example, get into relation with Greenland will have to do it on a one-to-one basis and ask Greenland whether it wants to engage in that relationship. Cannot be acquired, cannot be, could be invaded, but that would be illegal under international law. And I think that's something we need to say. Whether this would be a disruptor to Arctic governance, of course it is. And I think, again, we have to take these messaging seriously, because it could prove to be a disruptor to Arctic governance. I think the key of Arctic governance, whether you believe in Arctic exceptionalism or not, has always been trying to promote peaceful relationship in the region. And I think that's something that we need to keep in sight. That's exactly the outcome that we want. It is a peaceful Arctic region. So it's something that, again, we need to take seriously, because we might have to diffuse it further down the line, but also that we shouldn't be taken by surprise if something happens or if another disruptor comes into the system. When we talk about resilience of treaties and when we talk about resilience of Arctic governance, we have, as I said, we have to talk about Arctic governance as a whole. This fragmented ecosystem is still a ecosystem. So you have to look at the resilience of that, and that a disruptor like that you described could also prove to have a snowballing effect on other kind of collaboration that is destabilizing, so to say. So I think we have to take it seriously, at least to oppose it.
Thank you. And I really enjoyed what you said. The key to whether one believes in Arctic exceptionalism or not is peace in the Arctic. And I think that's a very lovely takeaway. And thank you so much for taking the time. And thank you for listening.